When a civilization splits in two, the fracture rarely begins with a grand debate over philosophy. It begins when people stop understanding one another's everyday words. Long before the great kingdoms of the Latin West and the Greek East officially severed ties, they had already committed the quietest form of schism. They had lost the capacity to communicate. As the bilingual unity of the old Roman Empire decayed, it left behind two isolated worlds, one thinking in the rigid, legalistic prose of Latin law, and the other praying in the mystical, speculative poetry of Greek theology. The Great Schism was not a sudden theological disagreement, but the final, visible breaking point of two cultures that had simply drifted too far apart to hear each other anymore. Historical turning points are rarely born in a vacuum, though human memory prefers the neatness of a single definitive date. In popular historical consciousness, the Great Schism between Eastern Orthodoxy and Western Catholicism is neatly pinned to July 16, 1054. On that summer afternoon, a papal legation marched into the cathedral of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople and slammed a decree of excommunication onto the high altar. Yet no serious modern scholar maintains that the fracture of Christendom truly began on that day. The events of 1054 were not the sudden ignition of a fire, but rather the breaking point of an ancient structure that had been cracking under centuries of cultural, political, linguistic, and theological weight. The definitive break was a protracted, agonizingly complex process. It was a slow-motion divorce between two distinct civilizations that had once shared a single Roman citizenship and a single Christian faith. To understand why the Christian world fractured, one must look far back before the dramatic showdown at Hagia Sophia. The rift emerged from the quiet erosion of shared language, the geographical barriers erected by invading empires, and divergent ways of conceptualizing God, law, and authority. The schism was not precipitated by a single cataclysmic dispute, but by centuries of accumulating tensions that slowly turned brothers into strangers. At the root of the divide lay a profound breakdown in communication. In the early days of the Christian Church, the Roman Empire was bilingual, but as the centuries progressed, the Mediterranean world experienced a sharp linguistic partition. The Eastern churches conducted their liturgies, composed their theology, and read their sacred texts in Greek. Conversely, the Western Church, centered in Rome, adopted a Latin rite and relied exclusively on the Latin Vulgate translation of the Bible. By the close of the 6th century, this linguistic drift had solidified into a hard barrier. Neither group could speak, read, or comprehend the other's tongue. This was more than a logistical inconvenience, it was a psychological and intellectual estrangement. Christians on both sides were deeply attached to the familiar rhythms, idioms, and practices of their own localized liturgies. Liturgy, however, is not merely a collection of external rituals, it inherently carries a theology within it. The average medieval worshiper possessed very little formal education in abstract dogma, meaning they absorbed and understood their faith almost entirely through the patterns of worship they witnessed week after week. As the Latin and Greek liturgies drifted apart, the spiritual worldview of the believers drifted as well, fostering an environment where different expressions of worship were eventually viewed with suspicion rather than appreciation. This cultural drift was accelerated by geopolitical fracture. Starting in the late 3rd century, the Roman Empire was structurally divided into Eastern and Western administrative spheres, each overseen by its own ruler. The political center of gravity permanently shifted when Emperor Constantine founded a new imperial capital in the East, Constantinople, self-consciously designed as the new Rome. While the East thrived, the West crumbled. The Germanic incursions of the 5th century fractured the Western Empire into a patchwork of competing tribal kingdoms dominated by the Goths, Lombards, Franks, and Vandals. Although the Byzantine rulers in Constantinople still maintained the political fiction that the Roman Empire remained an undivided universal entity, the reality was that the political schism between the Greek East and Latin West had become unbridgeable. This separation was finalized by a series of geographic crises. The migration of the Avars and Slavs into the Balkan Peninsula effectively choked off Illyricum, the historical land bridge that had allowed intellectual and political exchange between Byzantium and the West. Where a bridge once stood, an impassable barrier now loomed. Furthermore, the rapid expansion of Islam in the 7th century wrested control of the Mediterranean away from Christian powers, with the sea lanes dominated by Arab fleets. Maritime communication and cultural contact between the eastern and western halves of the Mediterranean became exceedingly rare and perilous. Isolated from one another, the two halves of Christendom developed starkly different intellectual temperaments. The Latin West, mirroring the legalistic heritage of the Roman Empire, adopted a highly practical and forensic approach to faith. Western thinkers were deeply influenced by the structured concepts of Roman law, channeling their intellectual energy into institutional organization and theories of legal justification. The Greek East, by contrast, remained fiercely speculative and mystical, viewing theology not as a courtroom to be organized, but as a divine mystery to be entered through worship and the Holy Liturgy. These distinct mindsets manifested in how each side answered the fundamental questions of human salvation. The Western Church focused heavily on the mechanics of redemption, how humanity could be saved from the guilt of sin and how divine justice could be satisfied. While centuries of social and geopolitical drifting set the stage for the split, the concrete theological battlegrounds that emerged were deeply contentious. In the heat of debate, the immediate points of contention often masked a more fundamental clash of worldviews. Issues that modern observers might view as secondary or semantic were, to medieval minds, matters of eternal salvation. At the heart of this confrontation lay two irreconcilable visions, one concerning church governance and the other concerning the Trinity. The most formidable barrier to enduring unity was a profound disagreement over ecclesial power. Ever since the political center shifted east, the Church in Rome had increasingly advanced a claim of unique primacy, inherited directly from the Apostle Peter. The Greek world approached this claim with a completely different ecclesial model. The Eastern churches viewed the Bishop of Rome traditionally as the first among equals, but they strictly drew the line at total administrative dominance. To the Greeks, the church was meant to be governed by an equal network of historic centers, the patriarchates of Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. They fiercely defended regional autonomy against what they viewed as Roman overreach. This structural impasse extended to how doctrinal truth itself was determined. The papacy treated supreme guidance as its sole right, while Eastern theologians maintained that finality could only be handed down by a collective ecumenical council. This clash over authority crystallized around a single word quietly added by the Western Church to the foundational statement of Christian belief, the Nicene Creed, the Latin phrase filioque, meaning "and the Son." The genesis of this modification was originally defensive. The phrase gained traction at the local council of Toledo in Spain as a pastoral tool to combat the widespread Arian heresy among the ruling Visigothic tribes. By asserting that the Holy Spirit proceeded from both divine figures, Western theologians sought to reinforce the absolute divinity of Christ to a population that had been taught he was a lesser created entity. What started as a regional defensive measure eventually evolved into standard Roman practice. When Eastern theologians discovered that the West had altered the universal creed without consulting them, they reacted with deep alarm and strenuous objections. The explosive potential of these disagreements became clear during the 9th century in the Photian Schism. The spark was political. The Byzantine emperor deposed Patriarch Ignatius and elevated a brilliant intellectual named Photius. Supporters of the ousted Ignatius appealed to Rome. Pope Nicholas III seized the opportunity to assert his universal jurisdiction, completely refusing to recognize Photius's legitimacy and launching an official investigation. The situation rapidly deteriorated into an ideological proxy war when German missionaries, backing Rome's interests, entered Bulgaria and insisted on the use of the filioque clause among the newly converted populations. Enraged by this territorial intrusion and deeply concerned by the spreading alteration, Photius struck back forcefully. In 867, he issued a sweeping encyclical to the other Eastern patriarchs, officially denouncing the phrasing as heretical. Though this particular crisis was superficially patched over, it left behind a toxic blueprint. Beyond grand debates over power, the daily estrangement was driven home to average believers by ritualistic differences. To the average medieval mind, everyday religious customs were deeply linked to authentic faith. The divergence over clerical marriage was particularly bitter, creating profound social and spiritual friction between the cultures. The Eastern Church viewed the strict Western enforcement of total celibacy with dark suspicion, while the use of flat, unleavened bread by Western priests in the Eucharist was condemned by Eastern critics as backward. Eastern worshippers insisted on leavened bread to symbolize the living resurrection, and they viewed Latin ritualistic adjustments, like mixing liturgical wine with water, as deeply jarring deviations. Further practical divides grew over the sacraments. The West restricted the rite of confirmation exclusively to visiting bishops, while the East permitted local parish priests to administer it directly to their communities. In the tense reality of the 11th century, separating mere custom from essential doctrine proved nearly impossible. Every single liturgical action had become so weighed down with symbolic importance that any deviation was viewed as a direct attack. By the middle of the 11th century, the latent frictions of the preceding eras found a willful catalyst in the person of Michael Cerularius, who served as the Patriarch of Constantinople from 1043 to 1058. He was an ambitious prelate who envisioned an alternative administrative reality for Eastern Christendom, seeking to elevate his office to an Eastern papacy that operated entirely free from the traditional overrule of the Byzantine court. To consolidate this ecclesiastical independence, Cerularius actively engineered a strategy designed to provoke a definitive fracture. The geopolitical landscape of 1053 provided the perfect pretext when Norman armies decisively defeated the forces of Pope Leo IX. Sensing that the Roman papacy was severely weakened and militarily compromised, Cerularius initiated his campaign. He ordered the immediate closure of all Latin Rite churches operating within the capital. Simultaneously, he enlisted the cooperation of Leo of Acrida, the Bulgarian patriarch, to draft and circulate a provocative encyclical addressed to the bishops of southern Italy. This document launched a broad theological and ritualistic broadside against the Western Church, systematically enumerating a long list of alleged Roman errors, deviations, and corruptions. The aggressive posture of Constantinople forced a counter-response. Pope Leo IX dispatched a high-level diplomatic legation to the Byzantine capital, headed by the uncompromising and hot-tempered Cardinal Humbert. By the time the legates arrived, however, Pope Leo IX had died in captivity, leaving the legal authority of the delegation in a state of precarious limbo. Undeterred, Humbert refused to compromise. Negotiations rapidly degenerated into mutual hostility. The impasse reached its dramatic theatrical climax on Saturday afternoon, July 16, 1054, as the faithful prepared for the commencement of prayers. Cardinal Humbert and the papal delegation strode purposefully into the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, marching directly down the nave toward the high altar. Marching directly to the altar, Humbert slammed down a formal parchment bull. This document explicitly declared that Patriarch Michael Cerularius was severed from communion and cast out. Turning on his heel, Humbert marched out of the majestic sanctuary, paused at the threshold to literally shake the dust of Constantinople from his feet, and abandoned the city. A Byzantine deacon, deeply distressed and anticipating the catastrophic nature of the parchment, ran into the street after the cardinal, pleading with him to retract the decree. Humbert flatly refused, and the distraught deacon dropped the document into the gutter. The formal legal mechanism of the rupture was finalized in the days immediately following. Michael Cerularius did not waver. He swiftly convened a synod of Eastern bishops to formulate a response to the Latin insult. The Eastern patriarchs responded in kind, drafting a counter-decree that officially placed the Roman legates and their Western adherents under an equivalent sentence of excommunication. What had begun as an administrative standoff between a cardinal and a patriarch was converted into a total, formalized rejection between the two vast jurisdictions of Christendom. In conventional historical narratives, this exchange of anathemas is routinely highlighted as the definitive point of fracture. Yet the dramatic clash of 1054 was merely one notable milestone along a multi-century trajectory. Ruptures and administrative freezes had occurred multiple times during the first millennium. Prior to 1054, these historical fractures were invariably short-lived, routinely reverting back to nominal fellowship. From 1054 onward, however, this pattern underwent an ominous reversal. The institutional baseline was no longer unity, but an enduring state of suspicion, systemic hostility, and permanent entrenched structural divorce. If the dramatic events of 1054 erected an administrative wall between East and West, it was the catastrophic geopolitical nightmare of 1204 that cemented it in stone during the Fourth Crusade. Originally mobilized to recapture Jerusalem, the Western Army became entangled in financial schemes, culminating in a horrific systematic sacking of Constantinople in April 1204. Western soldiers pillaged great libraries, plundered irreplaceable treasures, and stripped the cathedral of Hagia Sophia of its gold, sacred relics, and liturgical vessels. Even more devastating to the Eastern psyche was the religious desecration. Crusader troops destroyed iconostases and placed a French prostitute upon the patriarchal throne to mock Greek liturgies. The trauma transformed a theoretical schism into visceral popular hatred. Greek communities began routinely disinfecting altars where Latin priests had celebrated Mass. The devastation permanently crippled the Byzantine Empire, rendering it structurally incapable of defending itself when the Ottoman Turks permanently conquered the city in 1453. As the shadow of Turkish expansion loomed, imperial leaders desperately sought to patch the tear, recognizing that Western military assistance required theological submission to the Roman papacy. At the Council of Lyons in 1274, under intense pressure from the emperor, a small delegation of Greek clergy accepted papal primacy and recited the creed with the Filioque edition. However, when the delegation returned home, the Byzantine clergy and populace fiercely rejected the accord, viewing it as a cowardly betrayal of the true faith. With Ottoman forces practically at the gates, an exhausted Eastern delegation spent months debating theology with Western prelates at the Council of Florence from 1438 to 1439. Desperate for a military lifeline, the majority of the Eastern delegates signed a decree of union accepting papal supremacy and the Latin framework of the Filioque. The union was dead on arrival in the East. The prevailing sentiment across the Levant was captured by the famous declaration of Lucas Notaras: "It is better to see the Turkish turban than the Latin mitre." The hollow union failed to trigger a Western military crusade, and within 14 years, Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, rendering the agreement totally obsolete. For nearly half a millennium following the fall of Byzantium, communication between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church remained frozen in a state of polemical isolation. The watershed moment occurs in December 1965 when Pope Paul VI and Ecumenical Patriarch Athenagoras I issued a joint Catholic-Orthodox declaration. This historic text officially nullified and lifted the centuries-old mutual sentences of excommunication that had been traded by their predecessors in July 1054. This gesture was a profound symbolic breakthrough, officially transitioning the two global bodies from formal condemnation to mutual respect and open theological dialogue. Yet despite these displays of fraternal warmth, the lifting of the anathemas did not achieve actual structural or sacramental reunification. The ancient theological wound remains unhealed. Chief among these obstacles remains papal primacy. Beyond that, distinct sacramental practices continue, with Western Catholicism utilizing unleavened hosts, while Eastern Orthodoxy strictly mandates leavened bread. Clerical discipline also diverges. The Latin Rite upholds a strict requirement of celibacy, while Eastern Orthodoxy preserves the practice of allowing married men to be ordained as local parish priests. Understanding this split requires us to look past the surface level arguments and examine the foundational anxieties of believers striving to navigate a rapidly changing world. To prepare for this historical journey, reflect on these critical questions. How do communities distinguish between preserving the absolute unchanging core of their faith and adapting their practical methods to meet the needs of a new era? When organizational growth and institutional structure begin to mirror secular corporations, at what point does efficiency cross the line into a betrayal of foundational localized values? In what ways do socioeconomic shifts and geographic isolation weaponize theological language, turning simple differences in practice into accusations of heresy? The rapid fracturing of once unified religious movements reminds us that the deepest institutional divides often begin not with malice, but with conflicting visions of fidelity to a shared text. As we prepare to investigate the bitter 19th century rupture between the missionary Baptists and the primitive Baptists, we must confront how a community's core identity can be completely redefined by shifting historical contexts. If you want to ensure you never miss a deep dive into the fascinating, complex history of Christian thought and church history, make sure to subscribe to Theology today and don't miss an episode as we explore the people and events that have shaped our faith.